You're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service with me, Alex Ritson. Many people around the world are trying to find a solution to climate change. The crisis has been the subject of countless scientific reports, protests and nature documentaries in recent years. Now, perhaps the most famous creator of those documentaries, David Attenborough, has joined forces with Queen Elizabeth's grandson, Prince William, to launch the world's biggest environmental award. The Earthshot Prize will award $60 million over the next decade to people who are trying to tackle the planet's gravest problems. Speaking to my colleague Nick Robinson, Prince William and Sir David explained why they created the prize.
We very much felt, and this has been 18 months in the making, we felt that the one piece of the jigsaw that was maybe missing out there at the moment was positivity. There's a lot of warnings and negativity around the climate, which quite rightly there is. I mean, we are at a very serious juncture in time. But I felt very much that there's a lot of people wanting to do many good things in the environment. And what they need is a bit of a catalyst, a bit of hope. And so the Earthshot Prize is really about harnessing that optimism and that urgency to find some of the world's solutions to some of the greatest environmental problems.
And it's not one prize in reality, is it? It's 5 each year with 5 important goals.
Absolutely. So we've got 5 Earthshots a year for 10 years.
The 5 are in different areas, the sort of land, sea and sky. The land of areas that need conservation. In the air, immediately about cleaning up the atmosphere, and on top of that there's a problem of waste in the sea and of climate change. So those are 5 prizes.
But so I'm clear, you don't have to be a scientist in a lab to go for this prize.
Absolutely, Nick. We hope that this Earthshot Prize reaches everyone around the world, from communities, schools, right up to banks, governments, corporations, and anyone could find the solutions that we need.
There are simple things that can be done, which may sound crackpot or have been hole in the corner things. We want to know about those things. The prize will give them that strength, that financial impetus to spread and be developed.
Do you have a sense of how this fight can go on to make sure that the fight is won?
There has been a world change. There is no doubt about that. People who thought that conservation was just a sort of cranky, harmless interest of a number of lucky people, until suddenly we realised that in fact this is a life on death business. I mean, this is a really serious thing. This is what we are, the disaster that we are facing, which is on the scale that has not been seen since mankind existed. Suddenly we actually see the writing on the wall. Suddenly we can actually see coral reefs dying. Suddenly we can see that forests are disappearing. Suddenly there are real dangers that there may be a tipping point in which the ice caps of the North Pole begin to melt, which it's doing already. People can see it's happening. It's a matter of great urgency now.
David Attenborough in conversation with Prince William and the BBC's Nick Robinson. Now to the latest development on Spain's coronavirus response and a significant ruling by a court in the capital, Madrid. It's rejected a recently imposed order that would have placed restrictions on the city and several neighbouring towns. Let's go to Guy Hedgeko in Madrid for the latest. Guy, how did this come about and what does it mean for the measures that the government wanted to implement?
Well, it came about because the central government drew up this series of measures for the city of Madrid and for 9 surrounding cities just over a week ago. And it said that people should not be allowed in and out of those cities. There should be restrictions on public spaces and bars and so on. These were measures affecting nearly 5 million people. They came into effect finally on Friday of last week. And nonetheless, they required the approval of a court of law in order to remain in place and in order, for example, for the civil guard and the police to be able to fine people if they violated the measures. Now, today we've got the ruling from the court of law, but it hasn't approved these measures. It says that they're outside the law, that they violate the fundamental rights of citizens here in Madrid, and that therefore they no longer have any effect. So in theory, as of now, these measures are no longer in place, although the central government is able to appeal.
So does this mean that the lockdown is over?
Well, in theory, it does. I mean, it was always a partial lockdown. It wasn't like the kind of lockdown we saw earlier on in the year, but it did very much restrict movement for people. And there has been, I should point out, a barrage of legal action, of other appeals against these measures by individuals and by political parties, even by the local government here, which was not, did not agree with these measures. It had appealed against them as well. So this is seen very much as a victory for those people, even though it wasn't a result of an appeal, and very much as a setback for the central government, which sees Madrid as the centre of Spain's second wave of coronavirus and the focus of that second wave.
Guy Hedgecoe in Madrid, thank you. Meanwhile, in Germany, further measures are being put in place, including restrictions on alcohol sales after a sudden spike in cases. More than 4,000 new COVID-19 infections have been logged over the last 24 hours, the highest toll since April. The president of the Robert Koch Institute, the government's leading disease control agency, said Germans must be wary of complacency.
We've been doing well because we've been following the measures, and I'd like to thank everyone for that. But the current situation worries me a lot. We don't know how the situation in Germany will develop in the coming weeks. It's possible we'll see more than 10,000 new cases a day. It's possible the virus will spread out of control. But my hope is different.
From Berlin, our correspondent Jenny Hill told me more.
When you look at these figures today and you see the enormous jump, 4,000 odd new cases, it's a big increase on the previous 24-hour figure. It's understandable that people are nervous. The authorities here, the health authorities, actually rather fortuitously had planned a press conference to update us all on the autumn situation with COVID anyhow. During that press conference, they said, yes, we are worried. But at the moment, actually, the situation is still under control. We're still managing to keep a lid on this. The concern, of course, though, is that if the cases continue to rise along this current trajectory, then there is going to be a problem.
Even at these numbers, Germany actually compares quite well to a lot of other countries around the world. Are they actually going to do things differently as a result of this? What's going to change? Because Germany had been regarded as a pretty successful country in dealing with coronavirus.
Yes, and I think actually if you compare the figures here to what we're seeing in the UK, France, Spain, actually the numbers are still relatively low. And I think Germany is taking the view that they're going to do more of the same. So they're very much reliant on tracking and tracing any outbreaks. That's key to their strategy. They're also pleading with citizens to continue to make sure they social distance and wear their masks and so on. But one other thing we are starting to see is the German authorities put a real emphasis on ventilation, making sure you've got the windows open if you're gathering inside, trying to get as much circulation of air as possible. Just actually last week, earlier this week, I went to see a firm that's starting to make for schools, for classrooms, an air purification system, because this is really sort of the new buzzword for Germany, ventilation. But I think it all comes down, certainly here, to doing what Germany has done before. The real concern for the authorities are the number of people getting together for big parties, big gatherings, religious gatherings and so on. It's the paradox, and we see it everywhere. The better a country deals with a pandemic, the more likely the people living there are to say, well, what's the problem? I don't know anyone who's got this. What are they talking about? I'm going to go ahead with my life as planned. And that is what the German authorities, I think, are coming up against.
Jenny Hill in Berlin. You're listening to the BBC World Service. Debbie has the headlines.
A court in Spain has struck down the government's imposition of a partial coronavirus lockdown in Madrid, ruling that it is an infringement of basic rights. The German health minister has described as worrying the country's sharp rise in COVID infections, and a prominent Iranian rights activist, Narges Mohammadi, has been released from prison early.
Yes, let's get more on that story. Our Middle East analyst Sebastian Usher joins us now. Sebastian, tell us about Narges Mohammadi and why she's been released.
She's a human rights activist, as you heard there. She has been vice president of a group that was set up by the Nobel Prize winner Shireen Ebadi. She has been in prison before. Back in 2011, she was in prison and then she was rearrested in 2015, and the next year after that she was sentenced to 16 years, but actually 10 years to serve for starting illegally a group, essentially a human rights group. So she's served about 5.5 years of that sentence. We're not entirely sure why she's been released right now. I mean, there's two possibilities, perhaps both are true to some extent. The senior judicial official where her prison is said that she was released due to a new law in Iran which allows for sentence reductions. So instead of serving that 10 years, which was her minimum sentence, that's now being reduced, though there wasn't much more detail given about. The other is there's been a lot of international concern over dissidents in Iran, but Narges Mohammadi in particular in the past few months. There are reports that she was suffering from coronavirus. She has pre-existing conditions. She sent a letter from jail, which was published just last month, which detailed, she didn't want to concentrate on herself particularly, but detailed the abuse that she's faced and that others have. And it cast a stark light on how political prisoners are treated. The EU, the UN stepped in and made big urgent calls for her release. So perhaps there's been some response to that from Iran.
Sebastian, thank you. Our Middle East analyst, Sebastian Usher. Now to the US, and as you've heard in the bulletin, the second US presidential debate scheduled to take place next week will be virtual. But in the past few minutes, Donald Trump has announced he will not be taking part. Gary O'Donoghue is in Washington and joins us live on the line. Gary, what have you heard?
Well, this announcement from the Commission on Presidential Debates, and bear in mind that's a sort of independent body, an apolitical body, it just came out really about 15 to 20 minutes ago, saying that they were going to hold this next week's debate virtually, the two candidates in separate locations. It's meant to be a sort of town hall style with members of the public asking questions. It seems at this stage as if they didn't inform the two candidates that they'd made this decision on grounds of health and safety. Of course, the president was diagnosed with COVID last week, and we don't know whether he's clear of the disease even at this point in time. But Donald Trump was, as it happens, on Fox News, and he said, I'm not going to waste my time on a virtual debate. That's what he said. So as things stand, he ain't showing up.
So is this because of coronavirus, or perhaps because he didn't like the format that was being proposed here?
Well, the formats were agreed in advance and have been agreed for some time, so I don't think it's necessarily the format, although he's been attacking the person who's going to host, or was meant to host next week's debate as an opponent of his. He's also said that the virtual kind of setup means that the host can cut you off at any time. Some people out there might think that's a good thing when it comes to these debates. The president doesn't think it's a good thing. So that seems to be the position. Now, it throws up the intriguing possibility that will it go ahead with just the public quizzing one candidate? Could they do that? Would anyone? I'm sure Joe Biden might be quite keen on that, to give himself a sort of platform for an hour and a half to the American people. Will the president change his mind? Will there be any negotiation? We don't know because it's only just happened, but it is one of those things where, you know, these are a staple part of the American election cycle, and for one candidate to walk away like this after they've been agreed is quite extraordinary.
Gary, thank you. Gary O'Donoghue. While the rate of coronavirus infections continues to rise in many areas of the world, Africa is heading in the opposite direction. The number of new confirmed cases and deaths across the continent has continued to drop for the last 2 months. Health experts believe this trend is the result of several factors, including its experience dealing with other outbreaks of disease. The BBC's senior Africa correspondent Anne Soy reports.
Markets and other public places across Africa are slowly coming back to life. More and more nations are lifting lockdown restrictions. But it is a tough call. Their swift and somewhat synchronized closure of the economies has been praised. Health experts like the WHO's Regional Director for Africa, Dr. Matshidiso Moeti, say they helped to slow down the spread of COVID-19 and actually contain it in some cases. But she also has a word of caution for Africa's leaders.
They took very tough decisions early on and imposed very drastic measures. And I think the social and economic impact of these is something that's going to be quite profound. So it's at a high cost that this is coming. And what we need to do is to sustain this so that the cost is then, if you like, justified somewhat by the fact that we don't have upticks, we don't have exponential growth coming again, and we can as soon as possible start to normalize things and for the economies and livelihoods of people to start to recover.
A recent survey by Pollstar Ipsos, conducted in 18 African countries, says as many as 7 in 10 people feel anxious about lifting restrictions. However, most people agree that the economy needs to be reopened as long as measures such as social distancing are maintained. These public health initiatives, like hand washing, avoiding handshakes, isolating the infected and tracing their contacts, were widely accepted across the continent, says the study. That shouldn't come as a surprise. They were the same measures countries previously used to deal with outbreaks of Ebola in West, Central, and East Africa. But there's something else that has worked in Africa's favor: a youthful population.
In most African countries, we have about 3% of the population aged over 65 years.
That's Dr. Moeti from the WHO Africa region. She says over 90% of COVID-19 infections in Africa have been among people below 60 years old, and the majority actually had no symptoms at all. And finally, there's mounting evidence that climate too plays a role. Researchers from the University of Maryland in the United States say they found a correlation between the spread of COVID-19 and lower temperature and humidity. The virus spreads more easily in such conditions.
The BBC's senior Africa correspondent, Anne Soy. Debbie, you have some other stories for us, I think.
Yes. British Airways' entire fleet of Boeing 747 jumbo jets has been retired 4 years earlier than scheduled because of the pandemic's effect on international travel. The fleet will be replaced by quieter, more fuel-efficient aircraft as part of the airline's commitment to achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Conservationists aboard a fleet of private boats are conducting the first census of Australia's Great Barrier Reef. A flotilla has been assembled to help inspect up to 150 ecologically significant sites over the next 10 weeks. The aim is to help establish the impact of climate change, pollution and other threats to the reef. Andy Ridley, head of Citizens of the Great Barrier Reef, who are launching the project, says it will take a huge effort to make the survey work.
The Great Reef Census involves a whole load of organisations who work on the reef, from tourism operators to super yacht owners to research stations, universities. There's 4 universities involved, including University of Queensland and James Cook University. And we've had some amazing support from funders such as the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, but it's a really massive collective community effort.
And Singapore is to launch what it calls Cruises to Nowhere to boost the country's tourism industry, which has been badly affected by the coronavirus pandemic. The cruises will have no ports of call and will sail in waters just off the city-state. Guests will be required to have mandatory COVID-19 tests prior to boarding, and the ships will run at half capacity. Singapore's plan comes as travellers in Asia have been snapping up tickets on flights to Nowhere that take off and land at the same airport.
Thank you, Debbie. A priceless scroll handwritten by the founder of Communist China, Mao Zedong, has been found cut in half after it was stolen from a private collection. The scroll, which had aged to become a blotchy brown colour with faded black ink, is thought to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It was among a number of items stolen from the home of a Hong Kong art collector last month. Our Asia Pacific editor, Celia Hatton, explains why this is so significant.
attention really focused on one thing, which was a scroll, around 3-meter long scroll that had poetry written by the founder of the People's Republic of China, Mao Zedong. We don't really understand why it was cut in half or who cut it in half. Police in Hong Kong have just said that it was cut in half because the person who cut it believed that it was too long. So there seems to have been some kind of misunderstanding about whether the scroll was real. The thieves who stole the art and antiquities from Mr. Fu's apartment, maybe they just simply didn't know what they had their hands on, because they seem to have sold it on for around $65 US. Apparently the person who bought it thought that it was a fake, and at some point it was cut either by the thieves or by the person who bought it. And who knows? There's so much notoriety around this scroll now. I don't know if it has been really verified that it's worth 300 million. We'll have to take Mr. Fu's word for that. But, who knows? Maybe because it's got such a story with it, maybe somebody will be willing to pay.
Why is it worth so much?
Well, because Mao Zedong is really a revered figure in China. I think a lot of people in China are looking back in Chinese history, looking back at the life of Mao Zedong, and really starting to value the fact that he took the time to write poetry. His handwriting is absolutely beautiful, and he took the time to really create these artworks while he was also building a country. And so there's a lot of nostalgia in China at the moment for Mao Zedong.
Celia Hatton. This year's Nobel Prize for Literature has been awarded to the American poet Louise Glück. As well as the medal and status, she gets a prize fund of more than $1 million. Our arts correspondent Vincent Dowd joins me in the studio. Vincent, tell me about Glück and her work.
Yes, and let's make it clear, we are pronouncing it correctly. It looks like Gluck, but actually it's Glick. She's 77, a New Yorker. She's relatively well known, I would say, in literary circles in the States. This name is not going to resound enormously with most people. It'd be interesting if any of the politicians at the moment say, great, we got a Nobel Prize today. But she was US Poet Laureate in 2003. She started publishing verse in 1968. She now teaches. She's had very much the kind of career you might expect from an American poet. Most people always speak about her emotional intensity as a poet. She doesn't write about great public things. She writes about what's going on inside. The Nobel Academy always comes up, of course, with a phrase when it's awarding these things. It said a couple of hours, just an hour or so ago, she's characterized by a striving for clarity. It's interesting that the last American winners of Nobel Prize for Literature were, of course, Toni Morrison, and then, of course, controversially, Bob Dylan.
Yeah, so less controversial this time.
Yes, and also because Peter Handke, the German writer, was a big controversy last year. People were worried about his political opinions. I think, basically, we've got a relatively unpolitical, uncontroversial choice this year.
And unfortunately, I thought it was Gluck when I did the headlines. Sorry for that.
Well,
Thank you. Thank you, Vincent. The main news this hour. The US Commission on Presidential Debates says next week's encounter will be remote. Donald Trump, though, says he won't take part in a virtual debate. Thank you for listening to The Newsroom.